Hi, everybody. My name is Maryyanne Fisher, and I'm in the Department of Psychology at St. Mary's University in Halifax, and I'm very happy to be a part of this Darwin Day event. I apologize that my talk is recorded, but with travel and time zones, it just wasn't going to work out. So today I'm going to be speaking about what is a feminist lens for evolutionary approaches to the study of human behavior. And really, that is a good question. So let's start. This is a screenshot of the Oxford Dictionary Online. I took it in late January. We can agree then that this is a recent definition and it's from a mainstream source. This proves to be important in just a moment. And within this context, just like scholars like Sarah Hrdy, who in 2013, when she wrote the preface for my book, Evolution's Empress, I'm going to employ the term feminism here by this definition to refer to anybody. So male or females who advocate for equal rights and opportunities for both sexes. You'll notice I'm doing the binary on sex. We'll come to that as well if we have time. So here in evolutionary psychology, that means paying equal attention to selection pressures that have acted both on females and males. And the term becomes really only political when countervailing biases deny females equal consideration. And to that end, I have to spend a few minutes defining feminism, talking about the history of feminism, and arrive at where we are right now. So the term is argued to have been started in the 1830s, or the language around it, by French philosopher Charles Fourier. He was one of the founders of utopian socialism. And soon after, it started appearing in the Oxford English Dictionary and became known as a political and social intellectual movement throughout mid-century Europe. And now it's considered to be the most successful social reform movement in the world by the majority of scholars. And that can be largely credited to this book. So Betty Friedan wrote The Feminist Mystique in 1963, where she encouraged women to break free from the concept that their true fulfillment was to be found through dedication to household labor and in their roles as wives and mothers. Now, she was considered to be quite exclusionary. So, for example, she was not pro-gay rights. She also really focused exclusively on white, educated, middle-class women. So her book didn't appeal largely outside of that demographic. Now, in order to contextualize that work, we have to discuss the so-called waves of feminism, or the four time periods. Now, this is a helpful way to understand the history of feminism, but it's important to remember that a movement can't be neatly divided into time frames like this. It's really just more of a loose definition of the different waves. And we also have to remember that this is reflecting what's happening in the United States rather than so much the rest of the world. So within the first wave of feminism, that's starting around the mid-19th to the early 20th century, this feminist movement is sometimes referred to as women's suffrage because the most important goal was to give women the right to vote and to be elected into political office. So these activists focused on subjects like married women's property rights, child custody, and citizenship. Now, many of these early feminists are also called maternal feminists because they were argued to be taking on the responsibilities of the mothers of the nation and were therefore more arguing, in favor of childcare and education because they're trying to take care of the country. While first wave feminists were often credited with giving women the right to vote, this was not always inclusive. And indeed, many first wave feminists in the United States and Canada believed that only white women deserve the right to vote or be elected. And that spurred, in part, the second feminist wave. So this was active in the 1960s. This would have been the period of the feminine mystique I just mentioned. That goes into the 1980s. It's sometimes what we call the women's movement in passing. Now, feminists in this time period were generally concentrated on subjects like equal pay for equal work or access to birth control and abortions and ending gender and sex discrimination. The emphasis was on the idea that women and men are equal, arguing that it's important to recognize that equality and that they're both contributing to society in distinct but equal ways. Now, the third wave of feminism, that's more connected with the so-called riot girl feminist punk subculture in the United States. It was really a response to criticisms of the second wave being exclusionary of racialized and marginalized individuals. So the third wave was deliberately about inclusivity. And one of the key thinkers in this wave was Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality to describe the ways in which different aspects of identity and oppression intersect and interact. We have Judith Butler talking about gender as a performance. So we have a very different philosophy emerging at this point. And there's discussions about justice for people who had experienced discrimination because they were trans or non-binary or gender diverse and so on. The reason it has been criticized, the main reason, is because it lacked a central message. And that really spurred forth the fourth wave, which started in about, 2008, 2010, somewhere in there. And it's connected to the rise of the internet primarily. So it really builds on that idea of intersectionality and works to be deliberately more inclusive. It's focused on the justice of sexual harassment survivors, so our sexual assault survivors. It's centered around rape culture. And there's education about pronoun use, the importance of personal narratives. And social media has been really central to all of that to help feminists organize themselves and become more active politically. This is also reflecting the so-called Me Too movement. But it has also been criticized as of late for not talking about disability, gender diversity. There's been some exclusion based on class and race and ethnicity. And the whole idea of a call-out culture or cancel culture is now being somewhat condemned, as has what we call hashtag activism, where activists are talking about the change they like to see, but not really doing much to cause that real change to happen. Now, I mention all this because the field is, feminism as an ideological stance is constantly changing. And it's also so showing that sort of diversity in terms of who it's supposed to be encompassing. But there's always criticism. And that has really led to this. This is an example of the different types of feminism as of 2015. There's large disagreement about how many different types of feminism there are. So this one shows a list of 60. You'll notice here that there's no scientific feminism, but there's such diversity. How does a field come out of this? Like, how can we talk about feminism? And that's one of the reasons you might see the literature talk about feminisms with an S at the end. So my goal here is not to cause confusion. My goal is to make the point that if we're going to talk about feminism and evolutionary psychology, we've really got our work cut out for us. And I'm going to focus really today on what we call moderate feminism. And even within that idea of moderate feminism, there's so many different variations. But central to them is the recognition of the persistence of gender inequalities. But a person who would consider themselves a moderate feminist says that change depends on their individual action. They believe that change can happen without a revolution. They believe that there are sex differences in human nature and recognizing the importance of human limits. Now, there's also disagreement about whether there can be a moderate feminism. And I think the Darwinian feminists, so Sarah Hrdy, Barbara Smuts, Linda Fettigan, there's many others, they are, when you read their work, really moderate feminists by that definition. And this is from the Witherspoon Institute, which is a highly, highly conservative think tank out of Princeton, New Jersey. And one of their articles was, can there be a moderate feminism? And at the end, they say, underlined in red, it must acknowledge and respect some differences between the sexes. This is very different than radical feminism. So radical feminists stand with the proposition that differences between men and women are fully socially constructed and that the lingering disparities between the two sexes are completely traceable to discrimination. So the objective of radical feminist reform, therefore, is to deconstruct the world of patriarchy, including the ending of marriage and abolishing of family, so that a world of self-determination can arise. That is not going to be helpful for evolutionary psychology. Now, if you think that this discussion is over, you are very mistaken. So we're seeing articles like this in 2024 still popping up in the literature. I'm currently trying to write a rebuttal to this. So why evolutionary psychology is not feminist, assessing the core values and commitments of the evolutionary study of gender differences. There's a lot of work to be done to defend evolutionary psychology. from being seen as entirely androcentric or being seen as biologically determinist. This has led me to think about why people are motivated to do their science. And, there's different ways that we can talk about motivations. This might be useful. So May argues that we can talk about goals in terms of knowledge production or acquisition of knowledge. Then there's ideology, trying to get credit, trying to get profit. I think the Darwinian feminists are largely in the knowledge production stage. They are trying to produce accurate theories, finding genuine experimental effects, and trying to explain things in a way that paints a fuller picture of human nature. I'm going to leave this discussion at this point for today because of time, but it is something to think about further. Now, I'm aware that this Darwin Day event includes a lot of students, and I wanted to just spend 2 more minutes talking about how bias can enter science. I'm going to make these slides available so they can be distributed later on. But I wanted to show the different ways that feminist research might look at the scientific enterprise and think about the sorts of ways that bias can enter. So it can happen all the way from how you form your research question through to the types of literature review. So you might, for example, exclude a body of research that contradicts it or just doesn't seem relevant, but would actually paint a fuller picture. You might think about study design. So who's being excluded, why they're being excluded from your design, and whether or not that's truly necessary. We could talk about the hypotheses, where we might have assumptions built into the hypotheses, and therefore whatever we collect in terms of data is going to show that assumption. We could talk about issues to do with the lack of inclusive methodologies. So for example, are we always deleting people that do not claim to be heterosexual? Are we always looking at a certain demographic, right? So by doing that, again, we're getting a misrepresentation of the way that human nature is. And of course, the types of analyses that we do might affect it, as will the interpretation of results. Then, whether or not we publish a paper or we're able to publish a paper might reflect the biases of the reviewers and the editors. And if that paper gets picked up and disseminated, also might reflect bias. So there's a lot of avenues where bias about the types of research can enter and about the research questions that you might have. Okay. Now I want to turn specifically to evolutionary psychology. So if one extrapolates that list of biases to evolutionary psychology, and in particular the criticisms that have been leveled already in the literature by the feminist scholars, I think we can say that they fall really into three broad categories for helpful ways to move forward. So I'm going to just dismiss with a wide brush here all the criticisms about biological determinism and so on. I just want to focus on things that might be useful for us to think about as we move forward. So the first is to broaden the scope of the discipline. We might be really narrow at times, and we're not fully meeting the goal of understanding humans' evolutionary history. There's been a fair bit of attention to that now in terms of how the field has studied weird cultures for so long, so Western, industrial, educated, rich, and democratic. We know that that's not sufficient to get a really good understanding of human nature. The field must also, though, begin to re-examine its theories, test assumptions that have been taken for granted. So, for example, one of the things that we've talked about a lot in my specific research area is Don Simon's 1979 homosexuality book. It was fantastic, had a lot of ideas, but sometimes those ideas are taken to be fact when they actually need to be tested more fully. So if we want the field to be accurate, we must explore the adaptive mechanisms of all people, but also looking at things like culture, ecology, or circumstance more broadly, and using that to help us be more inclusionary. So that really leads us to this idea of exclusionary practice. So how are people excluded from our experiments, and is it necessary? How does exclusion prohibit an understanding of sex and gender equity? So you'll notice I'm using sex/gender, and that reflects actually one of my assumptions, which is that they are very hard to disentangle. And if you have questions about that, I can refer some literature to you. But when we talk about excluding people from our data analysis, on what basis are we doing that? And how are we capturing the participants for our studies? So again, something that we could think about moving forward. Now, for the rest of this talk, I'm going to review 15 examples of questions that show women's active role in human evolution, but I'm doing so with an eye towards context dependency and how the strategies they use reflect that context that they're in. These are only some examples, there's many more. In the abstract I wrote for today, I talked about how I would look at competition and cooperation specifically. And then when I sat down and I started reviewing the literature for this talk and really thinking about things, I realized I could go much broader than that and actually be a lot more concrete as well by giving you a better overview of the field. And so I'm going to walk through these. As I said, this is not an exhaustive list, but the focus is on work that has been done thus far. So showing the progress that has been made under a moderate feminist perspective and showing how this sort of approach is useful to evolutionary psychology. So the first is females' choice driving sexual selection. So through mate preferences, women have selected traits such as intelligence, social cooperation, and resource acquisition ability, and these have influenced the evolution of these traits in human populations. There's also resource sharing and foraging societies. So the ethnographic research on hunter-gatherer communities or small-scale communities shows that women often prioritize resource sharing networks, ensuring broader group survival during resource scarcity times. And this is very distinct from men's focus on competitive acquisition during these times. Then there's maternal influence on offspring survival. So women adjust their parenting strategies such that they often invest different levels of resources based on environmental conditions. So a food abundant situation or when they have lots of social support, that will change their strategy, ensuring offspring survival and future reproductive success, their own and their children's. Then there's reciprocal alliances among women. So studies such as those done in Eastern African pastoralist societies, the women there form reciprocal alliances to share childcare and resources, illustrating adaptive social bonding in response to communal needs. There's many different examples. That's just one. Women's role in informal trade and market economies. So research from small-scale agricultural societies shows that women are driving local markets and trade networks, adapting their economic strategies to cultural expectations and ecological resource availability. That has really begun to become more explored within an evolutionary framework as of late. There's influence on group stability through social mediation. So evolutionary studies highlight how women often act as mediators within groups, using conflict resolution skills to maintain cohesion. And this is a strategy that's tied to their evolutionary role in ensuring stable environments for the raising of their offspring and therefore improving offspring survival. Then there's context-specific mating strategies. This becomes a sore point for many feminists in the literature. So women adjust their preferences. So for example, seeking males with resource-rich traits in harsh environments and those with caregiving traits in stable settings, which demonstrates flexibility based on ecological pressures. Their role in cultural transmission. So women as primary caregivers have been shown to shape cultural norms by teaching specific cultural practices or influencing the evolution of shared knowledge that's essential for group survival and cohesion. Again, with the goal of improving their own potential reproductive success and the survivability and reproductive success of their children. Cooperative breeding. There's lots of evidence around that now. So findings suggest that women, through so-called alloparenting systems, where the relatives are non-kin assist with child rearing, they create networks of mutual support to enhance the reproductive success in resource-stressed contexts in particular. There's leadership in resource allocation decisions. So research is revealing that in many small-scale societies, women are pivotal in deciding how scarce resources should be distributed, often prioritizing fairness and long-term community benefit over their individual gain. Cultural modulation of competitive behavior. So studies are showing that women compete more indirectly than men. We've been seeing that now for several decades. But they're also leveraging their social networks or reputation management based on cultural attitudes towards female competition, reflecting multifaceted adaptation to societal norms. Then there's women as active hunters in foraging societies. So ethnographic data from populations such as the Agta of the Philippines challenge traditional so-called gender roles, showing women engaging in hunting activities complementary to men's, but also actively contributing to survival. Last three, social strategy changes in response to crisis. So during periods of ecological stress, such as famine, historical analyses show that women often form tighter kinship groups or rely more heavily on communal sharing arrangements, adapting their strategies to the current needs. Then there's adaptive fertility patterns. So research indicates that women regulate reproductive timing and offspring spacing in response to environmental conditions, such as resource predictability. And this demonstrates long-term planning for their offspring's reproductive success and survivability. And last, the impact of polygyny on alliance formation. So in polygynous societies, women often form alliances with co-wives to secure resources and mutual support, demonstrating their adaptive capacity in navigating male-dominated social structures. Now, as I said, that was a quick overview of 15 distinct areas in which women have been active agents within human evolution. And in closing, I think that the moderate feminist point of view is really important here. And it's going to help continue to inform evolutionary psychology when we talk about women as strategists in particular. So everybody's a strategist when it comes to evolutionary perspectives. But it also here means recognizing that we have challenges in terms of understanding women's side a little bit more. So we have a field that has done, I think, quite well as of late, but we still need to think about these big questions, such as how do women's strategies shape inclusive fitness? And you'll notice here, I'm not saying who's inclusive fitness. So there's a lot of room to discuss that. We have to talk about, I think, the unique and adaptive behaviors that women exhibit under particular social ecological constraints. So how are their behaviors adapted to specific contexts? Now, in closing, again, I think we need to continue to look at people, all people as strategists. And I think we have to be less quick to exclude people from our research studies or from being the topics of our investigations. And I am again here focusing on women, so how inclusive fitness is a driving force for women's strategies. We've talked about context-dependent responses to cultural and ecological pressures in those 15 examples I provided. And in doing so, I think we need to see how women are balancing reproductive goals, resource allocation, and alliance formation or disintegration, because they're using these complex social strategies to ensure their own survival, the survival of their kin, the survival of their offspring. And that is going to necessitate a constant back and forth between cooperation and competition, for example. So they're being very strategic in their choices. All right, thank you so much for your time and attention. You have my email address there. I would love to hear from you. And again, if you have any questions or would like some references, please reach out.